Welcome to Beyond the Limits, the podcast where two doctors navigate the murky world of wellness and peak performance, separating fact from fiction and science from snake oil.
I'm Mike Forsyth, that's Matt Clark, and we are the fourth most popular health and fitness podcast in Qatar.
So shout out to our Qatari listener. In all seriousness, we have got an absolute corker of an episode lined up here. We welcome Dr Hugh Harvey onto the show. And I think this episode is for everyone, whether you are a doctor anxious to understand the current and future use cases of AI and how that might change the way you work, or whether you're a patient wondering how AI is being used when you see a doctor.
Yeah, this is great. We've talked a little bit about medical AI in the past, in previous episodes, but now we've got someone who really knows what they're talking about. Hugh is one of the foremost names in medical AI in the country, and he really puts us through our paces in this episode. This is Beyond the Limits, and this is Hugh Harvey.
Mike, there's a lot of excitement and hubris around AI. It's pretty much everywhere, isn't it? Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, said almost 10 years ago that machine learning would outperform and replace radiologists in 5 years' time. Now, that has not happened. And to explore why that might not have happened and what is happening in AI in health, we're very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Harvey, who is not only a consultant radiologist, but is a bit of a trailblazer in the industry of healthcare AI. Hugh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike and Matt, for having me.
Hugh, could you please outline to our listeners maybe your background and explain to us why you might be qualified to speak on AI in healthcare?
I'm not sure if I've got a formal qualification in AI in healthcare, but I'll give you my brief resume and see if it works for you. So, as you said, I was a consultant radiologist. I became a consultant in 2014. At the time, instead of going straight into a consulting job after getting my CCT, I went into academia to try and be a little bit more cerebral about things. And I ended up doing a bit of research which involved machine learning and segmentation of radiological images. So I sort of was playing around with UNet models just sort of after they came out. So that was my first foray into AI. I then joined a startup, little known at the time, but now infamous, called Babylon Health, where I worked there for a year. Obviously, that was one of the first sort of big AI healthcare startups in the UK. And while I was there, became involved in medical device regulation and helping get towards CE marking, which is the regulatory conformity process. And then after that, I went back to radiology for a bit, decided that I much preferred AI and regulation, and joined a startup called Chiron Medical, where we were the first European company to get a CE mark for deep learning-based radiology AI. That was looking at mammograms. So after that, I set up my own consultancy called Hardin, and it was just a one-person affair. And now we are a team of 20 with hundreds of global clients. And we help startups, SMEs, and in fact now bigger companies as well, get AI medical devices to market, primarily through regulatory and clinical support, but increasingly through intellectual property, health economics, and market access consulting as well. So really, over the past decade, I've gone from doing and building AI myself to getting devices regulated myself to now helping hundreds of others get to market with their AI. So if you think that qualifies me to talk about AI in healthcare, then I think we're going to have a good conversation.
I think we'll do pretty well with that, Hugh. Thank you.
Certainly going to be better than Mike and I mumbling through these muddy waters. Today is the 24th of September 2025. It would be quite a good place to start, particularly for those who might be unfamiliar with artificial intelligence in healthcare. If you could give a brief overview on those different types and the different types that are being used in healthcare.
The way I liken it is always to drugs. I have said for a long time that algorithms are the new drugs, and they are in many senses. I mean, first of all, they have benefits and they have risks and they need to be regulated, but also they have types. So you as doctors will know that there are many different types of drugs and you use them in very different situations and they come with different risk profiles and benefits. So that's the way I kind of categorize them in my head. And so we have, starting off with a very simple AI, which is kind of what they call good old fashioned AI, which is human programmed systems where an input goes into a piece of software and an output comes out. These were deterministic. So the human programmers had determined what the output should be given a certain calculation or function within the software. Those are relatively straightforward. They're incredibly safe because they can't really go wrong outside of what they've been told to do. And they're very easy to regulate, and people understand them and can use them quite safely. And then you get the sort of the machine learning, which is quite a broad spectrum. But essentially, this is where a machine has kind of semi-programmed itself based on a lot of data that it's learned patterns from. And again, these can be quite deterministic. So you put an input in and you only get a certain type of output. Typically, these are things like classifying models. So you put in a radiology image and it will classify whether there's a fraction of yes or no. Then you have the deep learning based systems, which use vast amounts of data, more than maybe a machine learning system does. And these can do slightly more complex things, segmentation, for instance, drawing lines around things, or predicting patterns in data that perhaps a straightforward model wouldn't be able to do. These are slightly harder to regulate and harder to use and more complicated. I think you see the pattern where I'm going here. Then you have this new way of generative AI, which is kind of split into a couple of buckets. The first is the large language model. So this is basically a language calculator. You put in a string of tokens in written language, something happens inside that no one really fully understands, and you get an output, a string of tokens that appears to make sense. This is difficult to regulate. In fact, there's only one regulated generative AI large language model on the European market, let alone the world, and more complicated to use. And people are still getting to grips with ChatGPT and when to use it safely and how to use it safely. And then beyond that, now we're starting to see large vision models where the input is not a string of text, but it's a string of pixels or information from images, where you could theoretically put in something like an X-ray and get a text report out. And then you have agentic AI, which is a really tough term to deal with in healthcare. In essence, agentic AI is a series, either in parallel or in combination, of different AI models that may or may not be linked together by large language models and or large vision models that perform a sequence of tasks semi-autonomously, i.e. without human oversight. So agentic AI is kind of like a mishmash of everything put together. So there'll be some pre-programmed bits, there'll be some machine learning, some deep learning, maybe some generative AI in there as well. And that kind of creates a whole agentic system. Now, these are incredibly complicated to get regulated. There are no agentic AI systems regulated around the world, and people will obviously struggle to implement and deploy and use them safely, because it's essentially like bringing in some unknown person into your hospital and letting them run wild on your patients. And you need to understand where they come from, what they know, and how they operate. So I hope that kind of gives you an overview of the different flavors of everything that is labeled AI these days.
It does, and it makes my head spin a little bit. I'm sort of in equal parts quite excited about this, but also quite terrified about the whole prospect. And I think I'm particularly keen to quiz you on the generative AI, because certainly in clinical practice, and I'm sure you guys are the same, seeing a lot more people presenting with medical queries that you speak to them, they talk about what they think's going on, and then will admit, often quite sheepishly, that they've looked it up on ChatGPT. I also know colleagues who are using these generative AI models to help with differential diagnoses, and I guess that opens a massive can of worms. I think we'll probably move on to that in due course. Hugh, I wanted to actually first take you back to 2019. You co-chaired something called the Topol Review, and I believe this was a review essentially to ensure that the NHS is going to be a world leader in using digital health to benefit patients. My reading of it was how AI should augment rather than replace in healthcare and allow that gift of time. I just wondered, this is now, 6 years or so ago now, what do you think has changed since this review?
Everything's changed. In 2019, it feels like so long ago now. I mean, ChatGPT didn't exist. It wasn't on the radar. There's no such thing, as far as I was aware, in 2019 as generative AI or large language models. So we were still in 2019, really, we'd only just had the first handful of regulatory clearances for deep learning-based systems, primarily in image systems for radiology and pathology. And that's why I was brought in, having had first-hand experience with those. But the Topol Review did not predict that kind of level of pace and change, and probably looks a bit dated now. So it was predicted and hoped that kind of AI would be an assistive force for doctors. Free up time was something that the Topol Review wanted to be able to declare. And I think, if you read between the lines of the Topol review, it was more about educating the workforce and preparing them for AI. We set up something called the Topol Fellowship, so lots of junior doctors could take time out of clinical practice and come and learn about digital health and AI. But it's almost like we kind of need to redo it completely with the new, capabilities that AI has. So when you say what's changed, everything's changed. The regulations have changed. What AI can do has changed. People's perception of AI have changed. I just want to touch on something else that you said, Mike, which is the patients using ChatGPT. Obviously, ChatGPT is not licensed as a medical device or as an authority on medical information. And I think anyone using it should know and understand that. But I kind of liken it to when I'm old enough to remember when Google was invented and became public. And everyone's like, oh, we're not going to need doctors anymore because we can just Google it. And I think the same is going to happen with ChatGPT. It's like you still need that human touch. You still need that human decision making, given the context of an individual patient. And I think, ChatGPT can be helpful. You hear these kind of anecdotal stories of ChatGPT diagnosing something a doctor missed, but so does Google if you just Google the right symptoms.
I got back from Australia and was asking an esteemed colleague of mine, what's going on with general practice in the UK? Where should I be thinking to, further my career here? And he and actually multiple people passed me the Topol review saying that this can give you quite a strong indication of what to get excited about and where to, invest some time and some energy researching in where the NHS is going. And it's just fascinating how it's completely changed and it's impossible to predict. The rate of change here is exponential, and our confined brains in some ways can't predict the next step, whatever else the next iterations are going to be. I'm just wondering, Hugh, in terms of this landmark review, trying to keep the NHS as a leader in adoption of healthcare AI, has the NHS fallen behind?
Yeah, we might be lagging behind in the adoption of cutting-edge technologies, but you've got to remember the NHS is an evidence-based healthcare system. There's nothing that we use in the NHS that doesn't have scientific research and evidence behind it. And evidence takes time. Medicine moves at the speed of evidence. And so, it just takes time. You can't just invent a technology and then the next day put it in the hospital. That's not safe. The other thing is you don't know the cost effectiveness in advance. You have to measure these things. So, bodies like NICE in the UK assess technologies not only on their performance and effectiveness, but on their cost effectiveness as well. So if a technology comes in and isn't cost effective and isn't performant enough, it won't get recommended by NICE. And we haven't seen that many AI systems actually recommended by NICE on that basis. So yes, you could compare us to other countries and use vanity metrics, such as, adoption of AI. But these are other systems. Potentially, I'm not saying this is the case, but potentially they're spending millions on AI and actually not reaping any benefit. They're just looking like they're doing something. So it's kind of showing the cards before they've actually placed the bets. So I think, careful on that. And I want to go back to another word that you used in a previous statement. You said it feels exponential. That is correct. But history shows that industrial change over centuries, millennia, happens not exponentially, but in S curves. So what I mean by that is you have an S curve. It starts off quite flat, and then it goes through a period of what looks exponential, but then ultimately it tails off. So I think we're probably in that exponential bit, probably nearer the top than the bottom. And I think it's going to tail off. I think what we're seeing is, especially if you look at the big large language model providers, for instance, we're not seeing massive increases in performance anymore month on month. Everything seems to be coalescing at a level of performance that's roughly similar. So I think don't be fooled by the time frame and thinking we're in an exponential curve. I think we're in an S curve. It'll tail off. And in 5 years' time, everything will get adopted that works and has evidence. And then something else will get invented and we'll get distracted and it'll be the new buzzword.
That's interesting to hear that. And that's quite reassuring in some ways, isn't it? I kind of look at this as with, like Mike said at the top of the show, with some fear and trepidation of like, what does the future look like? Should I even get too invested in it at the moment because it's just going to change. But hearing that, yes, like we've made a big leap and that maybe it's calming down a little bit in terms of figuring this all out, it's almost quite reassuring. And I guess that leads quite nicely onto the next line of questioning is, Mike and I want to just pick your brains on the current use cases in healthcare, the practices that I guess are being adopted or are slightly more robustly evidenced and proved. And I'm aware that your background, you developed one of these diagnostics with breast mammography, and that's one of the quite established forms of AI in healthcare now. Maybe we could start there and explain the use cases of that, and then we could just go through them a little bit, couldn't we? If you could just explain with the breast mammography and maybe more of the more later advancements in diagnostics, where we're at with the NHS.
Yeah, so breast mammography is an excellent example of a brilliant use case for a deterministic AI. So a mammogram is the type of X-ray that women undergo every 3 years in the UK to check for breast cancer. So it's a screening test. So we're not expecting the vast majority of women to have a cancer. It's a low single-digit percentage of women who are found to have a cancer on mammography. And deep learning-based AI is, to be honest, very good and very sensitive at picking up specific changes on images. So we developed a system that could ingest a mammogram, which is actually 4 pictures of the breasts taken at different angles, and then just pull out a deterministic classification of, is there a cancer, yes or no, essentially, and on which of the images it is. And then you could put some explainability around it, so try and delineate where the AI thinks the cancer might be based on the patterns that it's producing and seeing. Now, you say that is quite a well-established thing in AI, but it's not in use in the NHS. The screening committee, the National Breast Screening Committee, what are we now, 7 years since we got our CE mark, still have not approved any AI for use in breast cancer screening in the UK.
Wow.
Because, and this goes back to my previous point, they have not seen strong enough evidence that it is robust enough. So this is the reality. That's not the case for all AI. Screening is much more sensitive to very small changes in percentages. Because, as I said, you're trying to find a needle in a haystack. Or as I said, I was on the BBC 7 years ago, you're trying to find a needle within a haystack. Like, it's very, very low numbers. So any changes to the sensitivity and proportion in that can have massive consequences. And of course, these are life-changing decisions that are being made by an AI. So I think that's good to start. I mean, there are good studies coming out of Scandinavia and South Korea in particular around breast cancer screening using AI. But in all those cases, there's still a human in the loop in every single one of them. So these are not autonomous systems by any means. So there is only one regulatory cleared autonomous AI system in the world. They are a class 3 medical device, which is the highest risk. And they are autonomous for the simple task of triaging dermatoscopic images of skin lesions. So they don't make a diagnosis. They just look at thousands and thousands of pictures sent in from people from their homes of their moles or their freckles or whatever. And they make a triage decision. Does this warrant a human review? Does a dermatologist need to look at this? And that is adopted in a wide breadth of the NHS, but not all the NHS. So, despite it sounding amazing, you'd think it'd be a no-brainer. It's still not fully adopted across the NHS. So you can see, all of this talk about AI, there is way more AI out there than is actually being used by the NHS.
You mentioned about being the highest risk
Yeah.
for class 3.
So basically, if you are a medical device, if you are doing something that has a medical purpose, it's like diagnosis, triage, monitoring of a disease or condition, that's the definition of a medical device. If you're doing one of those things, you then have to classify the device as to how risky it might be. And everything you use is a medical device. You use them every day as a doctor. Wooden tongue depressor is a class 1 sterile medical device. An MRI scanner is a class 2 medical device. A radionuclide infusion pump could be potentially a class 3 medical device because you can kill people if you get it wrong, right? So it's just based on risk classification, and the higher the number, the greater the risk. Most AI systems are class 2, which is kind of medium risk. And the reason for that is they influence clinicians' decision-making, or at least that's their intention, is to influence your decision-making, right? Class 1 devices don't tend to influence decision-making. In fact, that's kind of the definition of a class 1 device. They're just a tool that can't really hurt people. Class 2 is about decision making. Class 3, in AI terms, is more about autonomous decision making. The only other autonomous software, well, there's two examples, but the most common one is pacemakers. So internally implanted pacemakers have a piece of software that recognizes when you're having a heart attack or AFib or whatever, and then they shock you. That has to be autonomous because no clinician can intervene. There's no time, right? But those are class 3 devices, not just because of the software, but because they're implanted in the body. So they have to be biologically safe as well.
I know we talked about actually in terms of there aren't that many AI devices that are actually being used in the NHS. One, as you say. I sort of feel like there's a lot of usage. I mean, I alluded to it earlier about things like ambient scribes. And for anyone not aware of that, that's essentially where you can click a button, you can do your consultation, and then at the end of the consultation, you click transcribe, and AI formulates your notes for you. And I know I use that fairly regularly. I have kind of mixed feelings on it a little bit. I know a lot of people use that. So is that something, presumably that has to be regulated to some degree, or does it not because it's not influencing decisions?
Well, you tell me, do you think that your note that you type after seeing your patient influences anyone else's decisions?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So if an AI produces that note, is that not influencing someone else's decision?
No, it is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in that context, but absolutely.
And you're right. It's a regulatory grey area, and I've been involved with the MHRA, who are the UK regulators for medical devices, around deciding what to do about ambient scribes. A lot of the scribes have self-registered as class 1 medical devices, low risk. Regardless, they need to be cyber secure, and obviously the companies selling them need to do their best to ensure that they're safe and as hallucination free as possible. And users need to be trained how to use them because, as you said, and I'd like to unpack your experiences with them, you have mixed feelings, and I assume that's because sometimes it's great and sometimes not so great. The problem with large language models is they're non-deterministic. You can have the same consultation with your patient and 2 different scribes will give you 2 different summaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a sort of running joke that I have sometimes is, people say, oh, she's in a bad mood today, in terms of this ambient scribe, because, we get days where it seems to me, you check it and you think, yeah, that's a pretty accurate reflection of the consultation. You might edit a few things to make sure but then you do get days where it seems to me, as a completely non-expert on this, that those hallucinations are there. Suddenly it will say a patient had measles last week or something, and you think that they never said that. I certainly didn't say that. So where's that come from? And I've become a little bit nervous about it, to be honest, because obviously I check every time and make sure it's an accurate reflection. But there's that fear that somehow you get in that situation where you think, did the patient say that? Or is it, you can't trust it. You begin to kind of doubt yourself with it.
And I've heard even worse examples of it getting drug dosages wrong. So for instance, warfarin doses. We all know that has to be very carefully monitored and titrated. And a decimal point can kill someone if they take the wrong warfarin dose. And I've seen ambient scribe outputs get warfarin dosing and pediatric drug dosing wrong as well. And so it is an area of ongoing research. But at the same time, these scribes appear to have such a huge benefit. The benefits would appear to outweigh those risks. And there's no reason why these things could not be regulated as medical devices on that basis. What I'm concerned about with scribes is if we just let them loose with no regulatory oversight and no thought, you would just create thousands, if not millions of mini hallucinations within the entire electronic patient record as a whole. And then suddenly you start doubting the fidelity of all that information, which I think everyone agrees is probably not the best scenario for healthcare.
We've talked about this off air as well, Hugh, and I've got another point that we should probably raise of concerns with ambient scribes. My first point is unrelated, but I was watching a football match a couple of weeks ago, and one team absolutely dominated the other. I think their final score was 4 or 5-0, but one goal was scored in extra time, and it was a penalty. And Google's synopsis of this match was something along the lines of this team wins in an extra time thriller. And it's like, well, yeah, you've summarised it there, but this wasn't an extra time thriller. This was a steamrollering of another team that wasn't in any way thrilling. And I guess with ambient scribes, they're trying to make summaries and synopsis from your speaking, and it's a bit like when you watch a film that's made by a bad producer of an excellent book, and they've tried to put it into a different format or reduced it into a more concise version, and if it's missing the nuance, if it's missing the detail that you feel was there, that's not very helpful, is it? The other point that you mentioned to me, which really got my cogs turning, and thought, gosh, that is nothing. I haven't heard anyone else speaking about this, because there's so much enthusiasm about ambient scribes and how, it's amazing. It creates this so much more eye contact with the patient. I'm staring at the patient, not at my screen, and patients love it, and it's freeing up more time to do other things. But you made a really good point of, if you are just automatically documenting your consultations and you're not having an active role in that, what happens if in a year's time something goes wrong and you are put in front of the coroner's court because of some problem, and you look back on your notes and you go, I don't really remember this patient at all from this documentation? And I just thought that's such an interesting insight into what might be a potential problem with this.
And I've got GP colleagues and friends who have said exactly that about ambient scribes. They said it is amazing. I get more patient contact time and I feel less stressed at the end of the day. But at the same time, I look back at the notes and I don't remember anything about any of these patients, and you lose the context. And I think by moving the critical thinking, which you do while writing a note, like, you're not just writing, you are actually thinking and processing information while writing, or just before your pen hits the paper, right? Or your fingers hit the keyboard these days. You are doing that thinking, you're doing that processing, and that gets buried somewhere in your memory. Like, you have processed that information, and therefore you will be able to remember it. But if that information never went through your brain, it's really difficult to recall it, and it may end up causing problems in future. And then, if we go to that theoretical court case happening, what happens is the judge will turn around and say, so who wrote this note? And they go, it was an AI system. Was the AI system regulated? No. Then suddenly, like, the whole kind of worms opens up, right? And I bet you that patient's lawyers will start rubbing their hands.
I feel the same a little bit about the other kind of AI that I use for my own kind of learning more than anything is open evidence, which feels to me like a more trustworthy version of ChatGPT, I guess, in terms of for medical knowledge, for thinking. The other day I had a query about how to manage something, and actually by putting that into open evidence, it provides you with lots of research papers that you can then study and work out the best way forward. So that feels like a really positive use of AI. But again, it's that kind of grey area where you think, well, I can't be making, or doctors in general can't be making decisions purely based on typing a few words into, it's a bit like Googling it, isn't it? And then just going with the first answer. So I guess that's a similar example, right, of that kind of unregulated usage that is still potentially helpful, but not regulated.
Well, there is one regulated product out there, the only regulated large language model that I'm aware of. It's a German company called Prof. Valmes. So they've basically built apples and apples essentially from open evidence. They've got a regulated system that you can type in clinical questions and get answers. And they are a regulated medical device. But this brings us to the topic of international differences in regulation. So in America, they are much more lax around clinical decision support and these kind of AI tools. They're quite strict on diagnostics, but when it comes to clinical decision support, there are specific carve-outs in their regulations. Perhaps you get the impression that America is ahead in terms of AI because they have a little bit more of a relaxed regulatory system, especially with the current administration, who basically want to rip up all the rules, as far as I can tell. So, yeah, I agree. Using these tools is a bit like Googling, but it's not the same as Googling. And I think as long as you're checking the sources and references that it's providing and using your brain to do critical thinking, you'll be okay. What the danger is humans are lazy. We all are, ever since we were apes building tools to give shortcuts for ourselves. We've been trying to avoid doing stuff or thinking about stuff. And this is just the next evolutionary step, right? But if we give our critical thinking over to machines, that will doom the entirety of humanity, I think.
I was going to move us on to maybe some slightly more positive topic rather than the extinction of humanity. And that's really just...
I am very positive about AI if it's done properly, if it has the evidence, if it's regulatory cleared.
No, I'm terrified about. I walked in the bookshop the other day and I just saw the name of the book, and it said, "If someone builds it, we're all going to die," or something, and it sort of set me off into an AI panic spiral. But no, moving on to slightly more positive things. Hugh, are you able to give us kind of examples? I mean, presumably there are these really promising developments in AI in healthcare that you're aware of, and that, yes, they may not have that regulation yet, but look like they could make a really big difference. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, so people are trying to apply large vision models now to medicine. So these are like large language models. You just input a whole image and you get a whole report out. So essentially a digital radiologist. So we are working with one client now who's trying to get that regulated. But of course, nothing like that exists in the world or market yet. And so the regulators are quite rightly demanding quite significant evidence for that. But that's the kind of thing that Geoffrey Hinton was, I think, referring to a decade ago when he said radiologists will be out of a job in 5 years. What he didn't realize is obviously things take time, but also the deep learning models were never as good as what the next phase of AI was going to be. Or maybe he did predict that. I don't know. I've never met him or spoken to him. But yeah, so that kind of large vision model, I think, is the next thing we're going to start to see. And it won't just be radiology, it'll be skin lesions, it'll be ECG reads, it'll be pathology slides, all that kind of stuff. So anything that you can put an image in healthcare and get a report out, that's what we'll start to see over the next few years. Then they will have to show that the health systems, they are cost effective. And they are likely to be more cost effective because they are actually doing the entire job, right? But there's still likely to be a human in the loop checking the output. Beyond that, then you've got the agentic AI, which I sort of put in the pure hype bucket right now. I've not seen any system tested robustly in any scientific way. I'm not saying these things will never work. Far from it. They could work, but we need to generate the evidence that they can.
I've got a friend who's quite deeply connected to a certain behemoth in the tech industry. Actually, I'm going to completely uncover the name of the company. So Microsoft basically are producing or have produced something called this clinician orchestra, which he sent me a document on, and it looked very impressive. And I think it's utilizing, correct me if I'm wrong, this kind of idea of this agentic AI. And it talks about how you can have a selection of different clinicians or these agents of AI, and they have almost a different approach to analyzing the data, and that they are more effective when used as an orchestra, because one might get a bit carried away with the detail, but you have another agent, it's almost like describing these kind of personalities of these like big high flying doctors sitting around in a room and assessing a patient and critiquing each other's work. Now, is that hype as well? Is this adding unnecessary kind of layers to what is a large language model? What are the merits of that?
I mean, it sounds fantastic. I remember that paper. I think what we have to remind the audience, it wasn't a peer-reviewed paper. It was a preprint, so no external review whatsoever. And it has been criticized by people I respect in academia for its slight lack of clinical and academic rigor in the way that they presented their results. That said, that system very likely does exist in a kind of research capacity within Microsoft, as you say, and they may well be making efforts to try and get something like that to market. It will undoubtedly need some kind of regulatory oversight, but if they can manage that, which I hope they do, the burden is on them to prove that it does what they say it can do safely and effectively, and actually deliver the tangible clinical benefits, as well as the additional benefits of time saving and all this kind of stuff. But then it goes back to our previous point, is right. Well, if we do have a system like that, why do we need doctors anymore? And are doctors going to stop using their critical thinking? So you get into all the ethics of it, which is not my expertise at all. But you'll have a lot of naysayers saying we shouldn't be doing this, and a lot of people pro it. I kind of sit in the neutral fence. I sit there waiting for the evidence. And I think a single preprint is not enough evidence. It's nice as a kind of research idea, but a preprint does not a product to make.
This is the kind of co-pilot brain theory. Is that right? We touched upon it already, but that feeling that doctors will get almost de-skilled by having AI as that kind of assistant, that kind of co-pilot.
Yeah, the tech evangelists would argue that if the AI is actually demonstrably better than doctors, then it's probably safer and better to use AI, right? And ultimately, their motive is profit, ultimately. I'm not saying on a personal level, but as a corporate level, their motive is obviously undoubtedly profit. And if they can sell things to healthcare systems with the promise of cost release by not having to have as many humans around, that is ultimately the promise of AI, right? Then they may well succeed. But as I said, they'll need the evidence, and the evidence will need to be incredibly strong.
It's interesting you mentioned about the ethics of it. I'm just kind of wondering, like, from an ethical perspective, there's going to come a time when will we be challenged for not using the co-pilot, for not trusting, again, in front of the coroner's court, why did you choose to ignore what the co-pilot suggested in this case? Or why did you choose to trust the co-pilot? But I guess that you might be able to explain that one away if it's been approved and regulated. That's an interesting ethical kind of quandary that I'm seeing in the future.
Yeah, it's a real tricky one, that one. The argument that if AI is better than humans, is it not legally and morally right to use the AI over and above the human decision-making process? And that is a really hard one to unpick, and it's so contextual. I mean, as doctors, no two clinical situations are ever the same, and you are constantly having to think on your feet and make judgments. And it's really hard to know if the AI is better than us at that. As I said, a single preprint paper showing that theoretically you can do that is great, but the level of evidence I'm sure you're beginning to realize is going to be so monumentally huge to demonstrate that can work at scale safely. In legal terms, I've only spoken to a couple of sort of lawyers around this, tangentially, is that there is no case law really for it yet in that kind of sense, in that there's been no, as far as I'm aware, no legal cases where someone has sued a doctor for not using an AI or ignoring an AI's output. Ultimately, a lot of these regulated devices all say a human should review the output. So therefore, the legal responsibility is with them to make that decision. And if they decide to go against it, well, they're allowed to do that because that's what the manufacturer of the AI system told them to do. But yes, we could get to a point where AI is better than humans, demonstrably, and the law states you should use AI. I can't think off the top of my head of any sector where that has happened yet. I mean, I'm thinking outside of medicine. I can't think of any sector where it's obviously just the right thing to do to use AI.
That's interesting, because I feel like the stakes being so high in healthcare, with, say, for example, a hallucination of the AI, that the acceptance of that it's not acceptable in healthcare. Someone dying from that, the risk of that is too high. But if you can't even think of a use case outside of healthcare, it's quite a telling point.
I think I'll probably just add as well to that point about no two clinical cases are the same. I think that's exactly right. I'd probably also add that even in situations where the clinical case is identical, the decision or the treatment is not necessarily the same with two identical patients because of that kind of human, joint decision making, and what's right for one person isn't for the other.
Yeah. So we saw this with radiology AI. I can reference a paper I saw a few years ago on lung nodule detection on chest x-rays. Fantastic performance, like 99% accurate, finding every single lung nodule. But as a radiologist, if I find a lung nodule in a 99-year-old, it doesn't matter. If I find a lung nodule in a 40-year-old smoker, it does matter. And so context is so important, So you could say, well, why did you ignore the AI? It's like, because they're 99, they're not going to get a massive lung cancer before somebody else gets them. So yeah, context is important. But I think with these agentic systems, they want to ingest the entire patient record. But then that goes back to our original problem is, well, if AI is generating the patient record and then AI is using that patient record to make decisions, is it not going to be starting to use hallucinated information in its decision making? And obviously humans hallucinate and get things wrong, and we put errors in the record ourselves. What we need to do is take great care to ensure that AI is making fewer errors than humans. I don't think we should ever go for zero error AI. I think that's impossible. But fewer than humans, demonstrably and consistently, is probably the better goal.
I don't really understand the hallucinations. Is this because of the way in which it's just predicting what the next word would be in these language models, and that has an error rate, and then it predicts the wrong word, and then hallucinates the whole scenario? Is that the premise?
It kind of wants to please you, right? That's my kind of very simplistic understanding.
ChatGPT certainly wants to please you, and that's why it comes across as quite, enthusiastic and, positive about everything you say to it. But I imagine a healthcare AI should be designed at source to be fairly neutral and less enthusiastic than ChatGPT. But yeah, the way that hallucinations work is they can kind of cascade. So as soon as you get sort of one token predicted wrong, the next token is then more likely to be predicted wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where you can get these really weird and wonderful deviations from the norm. And the other thing to say about all AI systems is they are trained on a broad data set. Obviously, ChatGPT and the like are trained on the entire internet. But if you look at sort of medical cases and you draw like the frequency of disease or prevalence of disease in a line chart, you get kind of a normal distribution. So you get the majority of people sit somewhere within 2 standard deviations of the center. And then you have these small, short tails at either end of really rare stuff that happens. And I think AI is really good at finding everything in the center and those 2 standard deviations. But the more you get out to those short tails, the less accurate it is. Actually, the really important part of medicine is serving those patients at those ends of the spectrum. And so we need more evidence that AI covers that breadth just as accurately.
Now, I just wanted to pull on something then, if you'll allow me, that you mentioned, Michael, about AI wanting to please you, because I realise there's a part of AI in healthcare that we've not quite talked about yet, and that's this idea of these chatbots. I think this is being used in practice today, and I don't know how it's been regulated, but you might be able to tell me. The idea of chatbots for patients who are suffering with anxiety or low mood, that there are chatbots, completely artificial, that communicate with patients when they're feeling low or when they're feeling anxious, and they're having quite a beneficial impact for those suffering with those symptoms. And first of all, are you aware of those? Is there a role for these in the future? Or is this an area that's developing?
Yeah, so definitely aware of mental health chatbots. Again, they run a spectrum of some claiming just to be well-being. So these are kind of companions just to keep you company or improve your mood, to things that make medical device claims. So we can improve your depression score. We'll measure your depression score with the questionnaire at the start and end of an AI therapy course. And that's a medical device because they are claiming to improve and provide therapy to a diagnosable disease or condition. Yes, if they work, if they show in clinical trials that they can improve the depression, they are allowed to make the claim and will get regulatory clearance to provide therapy support. But again, there will always be a human in the loop, or there should be a human in the loop in that caregiving process. But that also comes back to one of the points that's hit the news in the past few months, is that actually you can get ChatGPT psychosis or AI psychosis just by chatting to a machine for a length of time, because it starts to encourage you in your thought processes, maybe where it shouldn't do. And this is quite dangerous in people, especially, suicidal intent and things like that. And again, this is a really grey area of regulation. The regulations really struggle to control this kind of functionality. It's entirely non-deterministic. We have no idea what the AI is going to say in response to anything anybody says. We can try and put safeguards and controls, but invariably people find their way around them. But they also come with risks. And we need to make sure that benefit-risk ratio is really clearly understood.
So Hugh, with Hardian Health, you've been very heavily, almost exclusively, I believe, involved in the regulatory process of new AI products in the UK. What are your views in general about regulation? Is the regulation too light or too restrictive even? And why do you think that?
It's a really good question. I get asked this a lot. And it really depends on your perspective of things. So I perceive regulation tightness as a kind of pressure gauge. You could have it completely off, no pressure, where there's no regulation. I think everyone agreed that that's a bad thing, right? You could have it too full on, really high pressure, almost impossible to get regulatory clearance. And again, I think everyone would agree that's a bad thing. The problem with the pace and scale of AI progress, especially over the past 3-4 years, is that the regulations are set at a certain kind of tightness point for what the regulators currently understand is possible with software and AI. But the new capabilities are kind of stretching that. And so the regulators are kind of thinking, well, where do we tighten? Where do we loosen? And that's a really nuanced problem. And I work closely with organizations such as the MHRA and lots of other advisory bodies to try and figure out where do we need to draw lines. And the saying that I often use is that these gray areas of regulation very quickly become black and white areas, usually through single kind of case events. So something will happen where people go, okay, clearly we need to draw a line because of X, Y, or Z. And it's kind of reactive. It's really, really difficult to invent proactive regulation before things have been invented. In fact, almost impossible. If someone invented a teleportation device tomorrow, we would have zero regulation for it whatsoever. But we'd all agree it probably should be regulated. And there's no way you're stepping into a teleportation portal without someone having tested it, right? So it's kind of regulators are always playing catch up and they're always seen as the bad guys. I always try and reframe that and say, look, regulators are your friends. They're the ones who actually get you to market. Like it's the minimum barrier to market entry is like, just get your regulatory clearance. Like you, everything in life is regulated. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the transport you use, everything is regulated, right? Why do people try and complain about medical device regulation? Embrace it. It is based on the scientific process, as I've explained, of a positive benefit risk ratio based on evidence that you generate. Yes, that takes time and it takes effort. But as one of the famous philosophers says, the obstacle is the way. And that's how you move forward. And you don't move forward by taking shortcuts and sidestepping evidence and regulation.
With people approaching you with medical devices, what are the common misconceptions? What are the things that are commonly people getting wrong when they're approaching this process?
Lots of things. I think the number one thing is underestimating the amount of effort that's required in getting something regulated. It really is a significant resource and financial burden to get something regulated. It is not a 1 month, pay someone a fee, sign a checkbox, done kind of thing. It is a lifetime commitment to maintaining quality of something that will be used to make life or death decisions in some cases. And so I think people misunderestimate that. Once people embrace the need to do it and they understand why it's there and how to do it, it's a really enjoyable scientific process. It makes my heart sing when people click and go, right, if I do this evidence properly, if I write up this report, if I plan my post-market surveillance this way, not only do I know my device is safe, I can communicate exactly how safe it is to other people. And I feel like I'm doing the ethical, moral, correct, and legally required thing. And so it's about reframing it into this positive process that benefits everybody. And yes, it is tough. And yes, it's expensive.
I guess we'll start wrapping things up here, and thank you for your time. You have obviously thought you've lived and breathed this, and you've got so much experience and knowledge in this area. But Mike and I were wondering, are there any questions or dilemmas with reference to AI that you feel that you've not been able to answer yet?
That's a great question. There's so much that I don't know. I do not claim to be an expert. I don't know where this is all going to end up. I don't know how far and how quickly AI is going to scale. I don't know when the S curve that I talked about earlier is going to start to plateau. And I don't know sometimes if we are or are not over-regulating and overthinking things. I believe that in general, people who are producing AI systems in healthcare are trying to do good. Of course they are. I did mention, obviously, there's a profit motive for some, but there is an underlying want and desire to do good. And part of me thinks, well, sometimes what would happen if we just trusted them to do good and kind of gave them kind of a moral code instead of a regulatory code? But then the other part of me thinks, well, that goes against the scientific method. And if people come to harm, then, as I said, the regulators will get into trouble from the patients and their lawyers. So there's so many unknowns, but this is why I love this space, because it's not set in stone by any means. It is constantly moving and shifting, and it enables me to use my critical thinking capacities to the best of my ability and try and solve these problems at scale, which is what it's all about.
I think that's a really lovely way to round this off. Thank you so much for your time. Genuinely, it's been fascinating talking to you. I know Matt and I have been looking forward to this for a long time. Where can our listeners find out more about you and what you do?
The obvious place, I guess, would be our company website, hardianhealth.com. I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn and happy to join in conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hugh. I'll round things up because Mike is fleeting in and out of some kind of AI hallucination, something to do with his internet connection. But thank you so much for your time, Hugh. And thank you for listening. If you've made it this far, well done. If your brain is hurting like mine, go and have a nice lie down.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.